When the boys were little, one of my primary roles in our family was bedtime. I was the bedtime tucker-inner, say your goodnight prayers before going to bed. I was the storyteller, read them their bedtime stories before they'd go to bed. If you've been around here very long, you understand why that was my role of telling the stories, because it's a captive audience. Those little guys laying there and they can't go anywhere, so I get to just talk till they fall asleep. And I guess that's why I learned how to preach, is just keep talking till people fall asleep, and then that's a sign it's time to say a prayer and go on and call it a day. But I told the boys the stories. And it started out with, I remember Goodnight Gorilla was one that they loved. One of their favorites was a book called Brown Bear, What Do You See? And then there was a Polar Bear, What Do You See? And then they just went up a whole series of those, and would read those. We had a gift that the man who was my preacher growing up, his mother had compiled a book called Bible Stories from the Rocking Chair. And it basically just took a lot of the more well-known Bible stories and just kind of condensed them down into little short, brief Bible stories that you could read to the kids before bedtime. And as they got older, we would expound into other stuff. I started sharing with them some of the books and things that I grew up with and learned to love, and things I want them to know. Sometimes they would just want stories about my childhood. They'd want me to tell me about when you were a little boy. Tell me about this, tell me about that. Sometimes they want stories of our family, my grandparents or my parents or aunts and uncles and things like that. And I am unapologetically a proud purveyor of the treasured Southern tradition of storytelling. And I think storytelling is important, and I think God agrees with me, because most of what we call our Bible is written in what students of literature call narrative. Narrative is the fancy word for saying stories. Think about how much of your Bible, just right now off the top of your head, are Bible stories. Now, I think probably we have strayed away from that term because for whatever reason, I don't know why we assume this, that the word story sounds like, okay, well that means make-believe. And you think about Mother Goose nursery rhyme. Story has nothing to do with make-believe. It can be make-believe, or it can be a true story. By the way, Jesus liked to teach even in made-up stories sometimes. We just like to call them parables. He would tell a story about something. Maybe it did happen. Maybe it didn't happen. It certainly could happen. But he would use storytelling as a device to draw people in, to show them things that they would not see if you confronted them head on. Because sometimes if you tell somebody something straight to their face, just the facts, they cut you out. They won't listen. They'll shut down. Sometimes they'll react very angrily and aggressively back to you because they realize they're being criticized. Perhaps that's why God had the prophet Nathan go to David after the sin with Uriah and Bathsheba and say, David, I want to tell you a story about a man that had a sheep that he loved like it was a child. And he tells him this story, and David is enraged, but not at himself. He's enraged at the man in the story until Nathan says, David, you're the man. You're the man I'm talking about in the story that stole this treasured possession of this other man and killed. And David, I'm talking about you. I have a feeling if Nathan had just walked into that king's quarters and told him, David, you know what you did was wrong, we might have a very different ending to that Bible story. The point is this: storytelling is powerful. Storytelling is persuasive. Storytelling is ingrained in the fibers of us as human beings. Our ancestors used to sit around the campfire long before there was television, Facebook, or even radio, and they used to tell stories. My favorite memories of childhood are not of playing Nintendo. They're sitting at the kitchen table at my big mama's house at Christmas or Thanksgiving listening to all of my aunts and uncles. My mom was one of 11 children, and so when they would all sit around that table and tell stories about their childhood, to me it was more entertaining than anything that was on television. Stories are powerful. And I think that's why God employs the method of storytelling, to to tell us the story of Jesus. I appreciate David. Some of you might have caught on that there was a little bit of a theme in the songs this morning. I appreciate David doing that. I asked him if he would pick songs that talked about telling the story of Jesus, the wonderful story of love. Because I wanted us to focus on our doing that to the next generation. It's time for us to do another one of our examinations. We're almost done. We started back in January and we set a theme for the year. There arose another generation, talking about the next generation of people that will grow up in and one day become the leaders here at the Lake City Church of Christ, and preparing them for that day whenever it comes. We can't wait until that day. We got to start today. We needed to start 10 years ago. It's something that it's always in perpetual motion. And so we wanted to talk this morning about the importance of telling them the story of Jesus. Churches spend a lot of time, effort, and money telling the world about Jesus. If you look at our budget, you look under evangelism and outreach and things like that, you'll see a number of things that we are sending money to, both internally and externally, for the purpose of telling the story of Jesus to the world. We help people go to other parts of the world that are far away from Lake City, so tell the story of Jesus in that part of the world. And all that's well and good. We can always do more, but in the process, we can never, ever, ever forget that we've got to make sure that we're telling that same story to our children. Now, here's something I'm going to suggest to you. I'm going to say it right at the beginning. I really want it to be later in the sermon, but I'm scared I'm going to forget it because I didn't include it in my notes, and I don't want to forget it. So you may hear this more than once if I happen to remember it. When it comes to our children, it is important that their only access to the story of Jesus is not just the Bible. Well, there's the starting point. God's Word's the starting point. But it's just that. It's just the starting point. The story of Jesus has got to be more than just what they hear in the pulpit on Sunday morning or in class with their teachers on Wednesday night. Those are important tools and resources, and we should all be thankful that we have those to help us in that. But you've got to understand, we've got to make it a priority. We can't assume, okay, my young'un is right there beside me every Sunday, every Wednesday. They're in Bible class. Anything that we do or have, they're going to hear it. That's wonderful. That's important. And that's something, if you're not taking advantage of, you're missing out on a great opportunity to plant seeds in their heart. But I want to stress to you, that can't be the only thing. I used to go when I was growing up to my friends' houses all the time. And just about every time I was at one of their houses, their mamas fed me. But that couldn't be the only meal I ate, was when I was at their house. My mom and daddy fed me in my house every day. They made sure that I always had what I needed. Now, when I went to somebody else's house, if I happened to be staying the night with a buddy, I'm sure, Mama was glad that they would cook supper and feed me then. But she didn't say, well, you ate over at Brandon, your friend Brandon. You ate at his house Friday night. You ought to be good, right? No, they understood that they had to feed me every day perpetually. Bible class, devotionals, youth get-togethers, our Sunday assemblies, those are all wonderful. But that can't be the only time, way, and place that our kids are hearing the story of Jesus. My children need to hear the story of Jesus from me. They need to hear it from me. Your children need to hear it from you. And your grandchildren and nieces and nephews or any other children that you have under your influence or maybe under your roof. We sang 3 songs this morning. I love to tell the story, wonderful story of love, and tell me the story of Jesus. The question I want to ask you this morning is, are you telling it to those who need to hear it most? Are you telling it to your children every day in your home? Now, what is that going to look like? I want you to go with me in Psalm 78. That's where our text is going to come from this morning. Psalm 78. It dawned on me one day that some of the most significant and memorable moments in my life, my children had never experienced. Now, to me, they're memories. And they're big memories. Like, for example, I remember when the Challenger space shuttle exploded. Sharon Krista McAuliffe school teacher was on that. The reason I remember is because we were out of school that day because it was a snow day, which means in Tennessee it got below 40 degrees. So we had a snow day that day, and we were home from school, and we were able to watch it. And we were at my big mama's house, all gathered around, and we were watching it on television. It was a big news story. And all us little kids sat there around the television and watched that space shuttle explode. Just to show you how weird little kids see the world sometimes, I actually went outside and looked up in the sky because I thought that I'd be able to see it, because it was a spaceship going up into the sky. And I was confused because I didn't see it. And the TV was saying it exploded, but I'm standing in the yard and I don't see it. See, sometimes kids need a little help understanding things. I remember that so vividly. You know where I'm going next. Probably the single most memorable event of our generation, September 11th, 2001. I mean, that is just, I could probably walk you through moment by moment that day because it's so ingrained in my mind, and I know you are too. And those of you who are older than me, you probably have other events. For you, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You probably remember that. Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the Vietnam War. For some of you, go back even further, maybe it was Pearl Harbor. These are things that are, they're life-changing events, and they're ingrained in our minds, and they're so significant to us. But it dawned on me one day, my kids don't remember that because they were too small. They might have picked up some stuff here and there, but Case wasn't even in school yet when September 11th happened. You remember all the excitement around the new millennium, 1999 going to 2000? Remember how exciting that was? My kids weren't even in school yet. And it's so vivid to me, but to them it's just history. I'm making a point with this. Our children need to hear our stories, because the story of Adam and Abraham and Moses and David and Jesus and Peter and John and Paul, it's also your story if you're a believer. God tells those stories so that we can add ourselves to that story. And we realize, just like the Israelites had their genealogies memorized, they could go all the way back to Abraham. They'd say who their father was and their father and their father. And they could go all back. Why did they do that? Because it connected them to the story, didn't it? See, God didn't appear to Joseph, for example, and say, now, I want you to leave your father's house and your kindred and your country into a place that I'll show you, and there I'm going to make of you a great nation, and I'm going to give you this land, and in your seed I'll bless all the world. That wasn't said to Joseph, that was said to Abraham. And yet Joseph knew very well that promise applied to him because he knew he was the son of Abraham. And Matthew chapter 1 begins by giving us that genealogy that takes us from Joseph all the way back to Abraham. And then God spoke to Joseph, didn't he? And said, Joseph, you've got a part in this story too. That seed that I promised to Abraham that was going to bless the whole world, the woman that you're betrothed to, Mary, your wife, is carrying that seed. Verse 18 of Matthew 1 says, the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privately. But while he thought on these things, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream and said, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife. For that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she'll bring forth a son, and you'll call his name Jesus. Do you know why? Because he'll save his people from their sins. And Joseph, her husband, being awakened from dream, he went and he did exactly what the Lord bid him to do. The story that Joseph had been told his whole life, Joseph now found himself as a key character in that story. And I want to suggest something to you. The Bible stories that your kids are hearing in Sunday school, when they learn about Abraham and they learn about Noah and Isaac and Jacob and David and all of those stories that they hear, when they come to VBS and they hear those stories, your kids need to know that that's not just a story. That's not just some history that applies to other people in other places and has no meaning, value, or bearing on their life right now. Your children need to hear that that story is also your story. Because God came to you too through His Son Jesus and invited to make you through Him a child of Abraham. Isn't that what Galatians chapter 5 is all about? Galatians chapter 3 is all about? Where Paul talks about how those that have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And he makes this explanation. He says, and if you are Christ's, if you belong to Jesus, then you are Abraham's seed. You are heirs according to the promise. That promise that was made. You know that Bible story that you were told about Abraham? Remember learning about that in Sunday school? Well, I want you to know something. That story is my story, son. I'm a child of Abraham by faith in Christ Jesus. And those promises that were made to him were made to me. Son, you want to know why I plan to be faithful until death? Because I'm a child of the Father of the faithful. Remember in John chapter 8 when there's this back and forth bickering between Jesus and the religious leaders and they're saying, no, wait a minute. You're talking about Abraham as if Abraham knew you. You're not even 40 years old yet. Abraham's been dead for a long time. And then they make this kind of backhanded insult of Jesus, and they make this statement. They say, we know who our Father is. I think they're taking a cheap shot at him and saying, yeah, you don't know who your Father is. And Jesus says, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. And you would believe on me because he did. Abraham believed God. It was counted to him. King James says, imputed to him as righteousness. Because he believed God. Because he walked by faith. He was a child of God. And he said, if you were Abraham's children, if you had a place in this story, yeah, you do have a place in this story, but you know what their place was in the story? Is the villain, wasn't it? They were the bad guy of the story. The one that is out to destroy the hero, Christ, who's come to save the world. They have come to stop him. And that's why he says, you're of your father, the devil. Because you do the works that he does. You know what he was from the beginning? He was a liar and he was a murderer. And guess what? That's what you're doing. And you've aligned yourself with the enemy in the story. But if you'll believe, then you'll be Abraham's children. If you'll obey, then you'll be Abraham's children. And if you tie those thoughts together with Paul in Galatians 3, here's the message that we get. Even though I live a long time, both in geography and time, away from Abraham, son, I'm Abraham's seed. And the promise that was made to him has been made to me. And one day I'm going to inherit that promise. Literally, not just in prospect. And son, you can too. That's a whole lot more interesting than just learning some random facts about a guy who lived in a weird time, in a weird place, with weird names and weird stuff that happened. I want to suggest something very important to us. Our children need to know that the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Jesus is our story too. And the only way they'll know it is if we tell it that way. We've got to put ourselves in the story of Jesus so that they can see themselves in the story of Jesus. Did any of you grow up, guys, any of you grow up out in the backyard pretending to be Robin Hood or, Paul Bunyan or Babe Ruth or Mickey Mantle or, you see these stories, you read these stories, and then you go out in the backyard and what do? You play pretend. You pretend that you are that person. You know what they're doing? They don't even know what they're doing, but what they're doing is what story is intended to do. To help you see yourself in it so that you can aspire to it as well. Because you know what? It's hard for a little kid who doesn't even get to pick what he wears for clothing or what he eats for supper, to see himself as having a place in this great big scary world. But when they read a story about their hero and they can see themselves in that story, when they can hear about, I don't like when we say little boy, because I don't think David was a little boy. David was probably a teenager, but he wasn't a grown man, I'll say that. But when we read a story about David, this teenage boy who shows up at the battlefield and hears this big mouth bully running his mouth across the playground, and nobody does anything about it, and David says, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to stand up to evil. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that's important for our young people to learn? To stand up to evil? I think it's very important for them to learn that. Where are they going to learn that? One of the places they can learn that is in the story of David. Now that's all fine and well, and they should learn that about David and his faith in God. And he says, you know what? The same God that delivered me from the mouth of the lion and the paw of the bear, He'll deliver me from this Philistine as well. They need to hear that, but you know what they also need to hear? They need to hear how you have been able to defeat your giants that you have faced in your life. Whatever those may be, and they can be different for all of us, and there's probably similarities in all of us, but they need to know how you, through your faith in the same God of David, helped you to defeat your Goliath. And why you're standing here today with your victory. They need to see it in those stories, they need to see it in us so that they can see it in themselves and believe that they can one day do it too. Because you better believe they're going to be facing it. We need to help them know this is not just a story in a book. This is about real life. And I get it. Your story may look more like Job than John the Baptist. That's fine. Ladies, you may be thinking my story looks more like Rahab than Rachel, but that's okay. Tell it. Does God use those people too? God used those people too. And your kids need to know that God used you as well. Tell it because you want His story to become their story. And tell it because somebody told you. Where would you be if somebody hadn't told you the story? Look at the first few verses of Psalm 78. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from old. Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. He says, look, I want your attention because I've got a story to tell, and this is an old, old story. Isn't that what we sang just a minute ago? Old, old story. I love the line in that song that says, and those that know it best seem hungry and thirsty to hear it like the rest. See, it's an old story, but it's a story that doesn't get old. No matter how many times we've heard it. Because every time I read these stories, I see myself in them. They're not on paper. They're not just in black and white. They didn't just happen thousands of years ago. This stuff happened to me this week. This stuff happened to me last month. This stuff's going to happen to me tomorrow. These stories are as real and relevant as whatever's running across Twitter right now and trending. It's real time, but we've got to help our children to be able to see that. Because the other voices they're going to hear is, yeah, all that stuff, those are really good stories, but look, when you grow up, you outgrow those stories. I mean, it's okay to have that for church. I get that. It has its value. But it really doesn't have a place in the real world. You outgrow Mother Goose nursery rhymes. You outgrow Aesop's fables. You outgrow those things, and you have to deal with the real world. Those are the voices that our kids are going to be hearing too. That's why they need to hear us telling the story. And we need to tell the story because somebody took the time to tell us the story. And it's an old story. And the author of this psalm says, this story was told to us by our fathers. Do we want to tell the children these stories ourselves, or do we want somebody else to tell them? I want my children to know about God and what He's done from me. I don't want them to hear it secondhand. It's fine that they hear it from other people, but I don't trust everybody to tell them the true story of Jesus. I want them to hear it from me. Verse 4, he says, we will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation. It's not just our children that we tell the story. We continue to tell the story to future generations. Now, I'll go ahead and admit, my family thinks I'm crazy, and granted, I am a little bit crazy. I'll give you that. But I've already got at least the first 10 years of my life with my grandchildren planned out. What we're going to talk about and what we're going to do and where we're going to go. And if God blesses me with the opportunity to know them and have that time with them, you better believe that everything I'm talking about, we're going to make into a reality. See, this stuff is too important. And this is, I think, one of the benefits of being a grandparent. I'm not there yet, but I understand. I'm in between, and I understand the benefit of being a grandparent. I didn't understand this when I was 23 years old. I didn't have any gray hair when I was 23 years old. I didn't have any wrinkles when I was 23 years old. I didn't understand the importance of these things when I was 23 years old. I love my kids, and I love the Lord, but I just didn't understand what this world was going to do to them, what they were going to see and what they were going to face and what they were going to need to know to make it through. I didn't understand how important this stuff was at 23, but you better believe I do at 43. And I'm preparing for when those little guys come into the world, of how I'm going to tell them and show them the story of Jesus, because I want them to know it even better than their fathers did, because I understand how important it is. And the guy that wrote this psalm, he understood it too. He said, this is an old story that was told to me by my father, and I'm going to tell it to my children, and I'm going to tell it to my children's children. I'm going to tell it to subsequent generations. Here's what I would suggest to you. Tell them your story with Him, your story with Jesus. And here's what I mean by that. Tell them about your walk with the Lord. Things like when it began, where you've struggled, if you've ever turned away, why you came back, what you've learned from that time. I know that it's instinctive in us not to want our children to know the bad stuff about us, but let me assure you, they know. They may not have heard it from you, but they know. They pick it up. They hear things. They see things. They know. What they may not know is they may not know your side. They may not know it from your mouth. They may not know it from your perspective. And one of the most powerful, important things that our children will ever learn from us is that if and when you mess up, you can still be faithful. We talked about this Wednesday night, didn't we? I will mess up, but I will not give up. But son, there was a time when I did. There was a time when I did. There was a time when I gave up on my faith. And I want to tell you why. I want to tell you what was going on in my life. And I want to tell you how that happened. And I want to tell you what my life looked like when I tried to walk through this life without Jesus. And I want to tell you why I came back and what brought me back and how I came back. And I want to tell you about the reception I got when I came back. I want to talk about how I feared judgment. I feared condemnation. I feared whispers. But what I got was tears and hugs and celebration and laughter and love. And I want you to know that if there ever is a time that you fall to, and if there's ever a time that you walk away, that you will always be welcome back. You'll always find forgiveness. You'll always find love. You'll always find a home. Now that's the story of the prodigal son, right? How many of us in this room, that's our story too? And God forbid, but that may be some of our children's stories. They need to be able to see themselves as able to come home. Look at verses 5 through 8. We've got a story to tell because He has a story to tell. He established a testimony in Jacob. Now, the writer of the 78th Psalm is telling us what is the story that they've told to that their father told them, that they told their children, and they're going to tell their grandchildren. Now he's going to tell us what that story is. We don't have time to read it because it's a very lengthy psalm, but we can get the beginning of what the story is, and it's the story of God and His people. This is the story that they were told, the story of God and God's people. And what is the story of God and His people? Verse number 5, God established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, even the children who were yet unborn. Arise, tell them to their children. Why? So that they should set their hope in God. Let me pause right here to say this. He's talking about the laws and commandments and teachings that God gave to Israel. Why does He say that they need to be taught this? What are they going to get from it, learning about this? He says hope. Hope. Now, I don't think that would be the angle we would take. We would think, when you learn about law and commandments and things like that, we think about burdens and fear and obligations and requirements, and none of that sounds good and none of that sounds fun. But that's not the angle that he takes. He says, teaching them this will teach them to set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and that they should not be like their ancestors. Their ancestors were stubborn and rebellious. They were a generation whose heart was not faithful. It was not steadfast to God. The story of Jesus comes from His Word. It's a story that has to be told perpetually. Every generation has to hear that story new again. And it's a story that creates hope because it spotlights God's power. Every problem that His people encountered, God was able to overcome it. They need to hear that so that they know when they encounter problems in life, and they're coming. Now, at their age, the biggest problem they've got is, time out or recess taken away, or they ran out of chocolate milk in the lunch line. But listen, they're going to get big problems, and they need to understand when those problems come, there is one who can solve them. There is one who can see you through them. Spotlight His power because it produces trust and it guards them against unfaithfulness. Now, the rest of the psalm we don't have time for, but I did want to get the section between 35 and 40. What was the story of Israel? It was one that God constantly brought them into glory, and they constantly walked away in their own unfaithfulness. And God constantly brought them back again into glory. The rest of this psalm tells that story. It's a story about deaf ears and stubborn hearts and foolish decisions, rebellious behavior, shameful and painful consequences. But don't overlook that it's also a story about never-ending grace, love, and mercy. We had a conversation in our house Thursday night. We were looking at Psalm 103, and we were talking about the importance of that psalm and talking about all of the benefits of being a child of God and how God looks upon His children even in their failures. The psalmist there says that like a father pities their children, that He shows pity towards us because He remembers that we're dust. And the conversation led into talking about how different people know certain people differently. Do you ever meet somebody and your thought about them is that they're stern and mean and harsh and scary? It might be a policeman or a judge or a principal or a boss, and you're just scared to death of them. We were talking Thursday night about a judge. If you committed some bad crime and you're standing before a judge and that judge sentenced you to life in prison or execution, do you think that the guilty view the judge the same way as grandchildren do? You think the judge that sentences a man to life in prison, do you think that the grandchildren of that judge are scared of him? No, he's probably just pawpaw to them. And when they see him, they run up and they hug his neck and they squeal and they climb up on his shoulders and sit in his lap and they share peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and watch Disney Channel and color and all this kind of stuff. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it the case that the judge is two different people? No, same person. So what's the difference between the defendant standing in the courtroom trembling because he's about to hear the words, "You're sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole"? What's the difference in that guy and the little kids that are going, "Papa, Papa, will you color with me?" The difference is relationship. They know that same man differently, don't they? And I want to stress something to your children, about your children and their relationship to God. The natural thing that's going to jump off the page to the children is the big stuff from God. The fire from heaven, the ground open up, floods and things like that. And you know what most people never mature beyond in their understanding of God? If you ask the average person on the street, their view of God is this: that He's angry and wrathful and wants to condemn and that you should be scared of Him. That's how most people think about God. I'll even go so far as to say this: that's how an awful lot of Christians think about God. But His children who know Him, who've heard the stories of His faithfulness and His kindness, if you've forgotten that story, let me read those verses to you. Verse 35, they remembered that God was their rock, the Most High, their Redeemer. They flattered Him with their mouth and they lied Him with their tongues. Their heart was not faithful towards Him. They were not faithful to His covenant. And yet He, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained His anger often, and He did not stir up all His wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. And yet how often they rebelled against Him in the wilderness and grieved Him in the desert. They tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. See, the kids hear that, but they need to hear that about His kindness and His compassion, His grace, His love, His mercy, and His forgiveness. And we need to tell them that that's the God that we know, because that was our story. Because I have been rebellious, because I have been stubborn, because I've lied to Him with my tongue, because I have rebelled against Him and grieved Him and tested Him and provoked Him, and yet He, being compassionate, atoned for my sins and did not destroy me. He restrained His anger often, and He did not stir up all His wrath. Don't let them only learn about the Lord from the black and white pages. Let them see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice, observe it in your life, and feel it in your love. Tell them the story of Jesus. Tell them your story with Jesus. And show them how they have a place in the story of Jesus. Maybe today you need to start by writing your own ending. Maybe your story hasn't been told yet. And maybe right now your story is still in the wilderness, apart from God. And so maybe what your children need to see is you write your own ending by coming back to God and acknowledging, Lord, I have lied with my mouth to You, and I have provoked You and tested You and been stubborn and rebellious. And Lord, I'm sorry, and I want You to forgive me. And let them see how God, through His Son Jesus and through His Son Jesus' church, will show you that mercy and forgiveness. Maybe you're not part of His family yet. Maybe you're not in His story yet. Maybe you're still on the enemy's side. But maybe you want to serve the hero of the story who came to save the world. Start by letting your children see Him save you. Put Jesus on in baptism today. We can help you do that. Come on, we stand and sing.